there is something nobody warns you about. Not your therapist, not your closest friend, not the hundreds of articles you read at 2 a.m. when you couldn't sleep because your mind wouldn't stop replaying conversations you'd already analyzed 1,000 times. Nobody warns you about the moment an empath stops caring about being understood. Not because they've given up, not because they've hardened, but because they've finally, completely, and permanently arrived inside themselves. And that arrival, quiet as it is the most dangerous thing a narcissist will ever encounter. We spend so much time talking about narcissists as if they are the powerful ones. We study their tactics, name their patterns, document their manipulation. We build entire vocabularies around what they do to us. Gaslighting, love bombing, triangulation, hoovering. And while that language is useful, while naming the wound does matter, it accidentally centers the wrong person. It keeps our gaze fixed on them, on what they did, on why they did it, on whether they'll ever change. And as long as our gaze is fixed on them, they still have us. That is the part nobody talks about. Attention is oxygen. Even the attention of someone who is trying to understand their abuser keeps the dynamic alive. The narcissist doesn't need your love to survive inside your mind. They only need to remain the subject of your focus. But something shifts. It doesn't happen dramatically. There's no single argument, no final confrontation, no cinematic moment where you flip a table and walk out the door. The shift is quieter than that. It happens somewhere beneath language, beneath thought even. It happens in the nervous system before it happens in the mind. One day, without planning it, without announcing it, something in you simply stops reaching, stops explaining, stops hoping that this time, if you say it differently, they'll finally hear you. The hope doesn't leave with a bang. It leaves like a tide going out, slowly, then completely, and the person left standing on that shore is someone the narcissist has never actually met. Here's what the narcissist fundamentally misunderstands about an empath. They see the empathy and they conclude softness. They see the patience and they conclude weakness. They see the willingness to stay and try and forgive and try again. And they read it as leverage. And for a long time, they are right. For a long time, the empath's enormous capacity for love is the exact mechanism through which they are controlled. Because genuine empathy does something that most people underestimate. It makes you believe in people's potential more than their pattern. It makes you respond to who someone could be rather than who they've proven themselves to be again and again. That is the beautiful vulnerability at the heart of the empath. And it is the exact door the narcissist never accounts for. Empathy is not a fixed resource. It is not a bank account with infinite funds. And more importantly, the same emotional intelligence that made the empath so attuned to the narcissist's hidden pain, so capable of reading the subtext beneath their cruelty, so skilled at finding the wounded child inside the controlling adult. That same intelligence eventually turns inward. And when it does, everything the empath has been observing about the relationship gets processed at a depth the narcissist cannot imagine. Because empaths don't just feel, they integrate, they make meaning. They reconstruct, and when an empath has integrated the full truth of what has been done to them, they do not come out angry, they come out clear. Clarity is not loud, clarity does not threaten, clarity does not need to prove anything to anyone, it simply knows. And a person who simply knows is completely unmovable. This is the thing that terrifies the narcissist, though terrify is almost too dramatic a word for what it actually is. What the narcissist experiences when they encounter a truly fed up empath is closer to disorientation, because everything they've learned about how to navigate this person stops working. The guilt trips land nowhere. The subtle digs find no wound to hook into. The sudden warmth, deployed with precision at exactly the moment the narcissist senses distance, creates no flutter of hope in the empath's chest. And the narcissist, who has built their entire relational strategy on reading and exploiting emotional reactions, suddenly finds themselves in a room with no echo. They speak and nothing comes back. They push and there is no resistance to push against. They perform and there is no audience. That is not a small thing for someone whose psychological survival depends on being perceived. Jung wrote about the concept of the persona, the mask we build to face the world. For most of us, the persona is a tool. We use it in professional settings, in social situations, in moments that require a particular version of ourselves. But underneath the persona lives the real self, the part that knows doubt and fear and longing. Narcissistic personality structure at its most essential level is a persona that has consumed the self. The mask became the whole face, and a mask by definition requires an audience. It requires someone to believe in it, to react to it, to validate its existence. When that audience withdraws, the mask has no function, and something with no function begins to collapse. The fed-up empathi does not cause that collapse by fighting. They cause it by leaving psychologically before they ever leave physically. The lights go off in Sid. Them, not in a cold or vindictive way, but in the way a house feels when the people who made it a home have quietly moved on. The walls are still there, the structure stands, but the warmth is gone, and everyone who enters can feel it immediately. That is what we're going to explore across the next 3 parts of this conversation. Not how to hurt a narcissist, not how to win, but what actually happens psychologically, neurologically, spiritually when an empath reaches the end of their giving, integrates that truth completely, and becomes someone they were always meant to be before someone convinced them that being that person was selfish. Because the fed-up empath is not dangerous to you if you are a safe person. They're only dangerous to dynamics that depended on their smallness to function. And that is not danger. That is freedom. Let's talk about what empaths are actually trained to do. And I use the word trained deliberately because it doesn't happen by accident. It happens through repetition, through reward and punishment, through years of learning which version of yourself keeps the peace and which version creates consequences. Most empaths don't arrive in adulthood simply wired for sensitivity. They arrive having been taught, usually very early, that their sensitivity is most acceptable when it is directed outward. Feel what others feel. Prioritize what others need. Make yourself readable, accessible, accommodating. And above all, do not let your own needs become louder than your usefulness to the people around you. This is not always malicious. Sometimes it comes from parents who were overwhelmed and needed a child who wouldn't add to the weight. Sometimes it comes from environments where emotional expression was unsafe and attunement to others was a survival skill. Sometimes it comes from being the kind of child who simply felt everything so intensely that the adults around them didn't know what to do except redirect that intensity towards something productive, something relational, something that made the child easier to manage. However it happens, the result is the same. The empath learns to make a home in other people's emotional worlds while quietly vacating their own. And then the narcissist arrives. And the narcissist, whatever else they are, is a person with an enormous emotional world that demands constant attention. They are a universe of need dressed as confidence. Avoid performing fullness. And to the empath, who has spent their whole life being useful in precisely this way, the narcissist feels like a calling, not a red flag, a purpose, because the empath has been trained to find meaning in being needed. And nobody needs quite like a narcissist needs. The pull is not stupidity. It is not weakness. It is the almost perfect alignment of one person's wound with another's coping mechanism. The empath who learned to abandon themselves to be loved has found someone who will absorb everything they give and always require more. It fits. That is the tragic clinical truth of it. It fits. But here is where the story starts to change, because the empath, unlike the systems that shaped them, has one resource the narcissist fundamentally lacks. They have the capacity for genuine self-reflection. They can turn the lens inward and actually look, not perform looking, not weaponize looking, not use the appearance of introspection to manipulate the people around them. actually look, actually sit with what they find, actually allow what is true to be true, even when it is painful. This is the capacity that will eventually undo the entire dynamic. Not anger, not revenge, not even boundaries in the conventional sense. Self-reflection. The empath's ability to see themselves clearly is the beginning of everything. And what the YC, when they finally look, is not pretty. That is important to say directly, because so much content in this space rushes past the ugly part to get to the empowerment part. But the ugly part is where the real transformation lives. What the empath sees when they genuinely turn inward is not just what the narcissist did to them. They see what they allowed. They see the moments they silenced their own instincts to keep the relationship comfortable. They see the times they translated the narcissist's cruelty into something more palatable, because the alternative, accepting that someone they loved was not capable of loving them back, was too devastating to hold. They see the ways they made themselves smaller, stranger, less true, in an effort to become acceptable to someone who had decided before they even met that other people existed, primarily as instruments. The seeing is not self-blame. That distinction matters enormously. Self-blame says you deserved what happened. Self-reflection says you participated in a system, and understanding your participation is the only way to ensure you never participate in that system again. One is punishment, the other is power. And the empath, when they do this work honestly, is not trying to punish themselves. They're trying to become someone who cannot be manipulated in the same way twice. Because the goal was never just to leave this narcissist. The goal, even if it hasn't been named yet, is to become someone for whom this dynamic is no longer possible. Not just difficult, not just painful, impossible. Now, here is what starts happening in the narcissist's world during this phase, because this is a story about two psychologies in relation to each other, not just one. The narcissist, who is exquisitely sensitive to shifts in emotional supply, begins to detect that something is different. They can't name it. They won't name it Bika. Use naming, it would require an honesty about the dynamic that their psychology cannot sustain. But they feel it. The empath's responses are slightly slower. The emotional temperature in the room when they're together is marginally cooler. The reassurances, when they come, feel different, a little more measured, a little less desperate. And the narcissist, whose survival instinct around supply is finely tuned, begins to escalate. This is the most dangerous moment in the entire cycle. Not because the empath is in danger of staying forever. They're not. The tide has already turned, even if they don't fully know it yet. It's dangerous because the escalation is designed unconsciously, but precisely to provoke a reaction, any reaction. The narcissist at this stage does not care whether the empath is crying or screaming or pleading or furious. All of those responses confirm connection. All of them mean the empath is still inside the dynamic, still emotionally present, still reachable. The narcissist will manufacture a crisis. They will say the thing they know cuts deepest. They will suddenly become the most loving, attentive version of themselves they'd been in years. They will disappear and wait to see if they are chased. Every move is a probe. Every move is asking the same question in a different language. Are you still here? Are you still mine? Can I still reach you? And for the first time, the honest answer is starting to become no, not performed, not announced, just true. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a person when they have made a decision they will not unmake. Not the silence of someone who is suppressing something. Not the tight-lipped quiet of someone holding back what they really want to say. A different kind. The silence of someone who has moved to a place inside themselves where the argument simply doesn't live anymore. Where the other P. Renzen's words arrive and are received but find no wound to attach to, no hope to manipulate, no fear to pull at. That silence is not emptiness. It is the most inhabited a person has ever been. And it is completely, utterly illegible to someone who has only ever related to them through their reactivity. This is the stage most people never see coming, including the empath themselves. Because everything in the culture around emotional healing tells you the breakthrough will feel like something. It will feel like strength, like fire, like finally saying the words you've been rehearsing for months. We are sold a cinematic version of liberation. The moment you stand up, the moment you stop accepting less, the moment you look them in the eye and say, with perfect composure, exactly what they are. But real psychological liberation rarely looks like that. Real liberation looks quiet from the outside. It looks to the untrained eye almost like nothing is happening. Because what is happening is entirely internal. The empath is not performing their freedom. They are inhabiting it. And here's what that inhabiting actually involves. Because this is not mystical. It is not abstract. It is a real and traceable psychological process. When a person has been in a chronically dysregulating relationship, their nervous system adapts. It learns to live in a state of low-grade hypervigilance, scanning constantly for shifts in the other person's mood, anticipating conflict before it arrives, regulating the emotional temperature of the room as a form of self-protection. This is not a character flaw. It is the body doing its job. It is intelligence, biological and emotional, responding to an environment where unpredictability was the only constant. But the adaptation comes at a cost, because a nervous system perpetually tuned to someone else has very little bandwidth left to register its own signals, its own needs, its own truth. What happens during the empath turning point is that the nervous system begins slowly and then all at once to recalibrate. The empath starts to hear themselves again. Not the voice that negotiates, not the voice that translates the narcissist behavior into something survivable, but the original voice, the one that said this doesn't feel right, before they learn to silence it. And when that voice comes back online, it doesn't come back timid. It comes back with the full authority of everything it has witnessed. It says, with no drama and no performance, I know what this is, and I know what I am outside of it. And those two things are no longer compatible. The narcissist cannot track this shift through their usual methods, because their usual methods rely on accessing the empath's emotional interior. They probe for guilt, and the empath feels something, but it doesn't have the old weight anymore. They probe for hope, and the empath remembers what hope in this relationship actually produced, and the memory is clarifying rather than painful. They try fear, and the empath, who has already begun to quietly map life without this dynamic, finds that the fear of leaving has quietly become smaller than the exhaustion of staying. Every lever the narcissist pulls finds a different mechanism than the one that used to be there, because the empath has been, without fanfare, rewiring themselves from the inside. This is what makes the fed-up empath genuinely unlike any other relational outcome the narcissist has encountered. Because most of the ways people leave narcissistic relationships, the narcissist has seen before. They have seen the explosive departure, the person who finally screams and slams the door. They know how to handle that. They wait. They reach back in with the perfect message at the perfect moment, and the emotional intensity of the exit becomes the bridge back. They have seen the quiet withdrawal that still carries grief, still checks their profile, still takes the call when it comes. They know how to handle that too. They simply wait for the grief to create an opening. What they have not seen, what they genuinely do not have a strategy for, is the empath who has grieved the relationship while still inside it, who has done the mourning privately, completely, and arrived at the other side with nothing left to lose, because nothing remains invested. That is a closed door, not a slammed door, not a locked door that still has a key hidden somewhere. A closed door that has simply become a wall, and on the other side of that wall, something remarkable is happening that has nothing to do with the narcissist at all. The empath is beginning to remember who they were before they made someone else's emotional survival their primary project. They are finding, often to their own surprise, that there are opinions they hold that they never shared, preferences they suppressed because expressing them created friction, dreams they placed in suspension because there was never space for them in a relationship that required constant emotional management. The process of recovering these things is not triumphant, not at first. It's tender. It's almost awkward, the way it's awkward to use a muscle you haven't used in years. They have to relearn the simple practice of asking themselves what they actually want without immediately filtering that want to the question of how it will affect someone else. But they do relearn it. And with each small act of self-return, the empath becomes more themselves, more solid, more present in their own life in a way they haven't been in longer than they can clearly remember. And this solidity, this increasing density of authentic selfhood is precisely what begins to make the narcissist frantic in a way that is different from any previous conflict. Because the narcissist does not experience this as the empath becoming stronger. They experience it as the empath becoming unreachable. And unreachable is not something the narcissist knows how to tolerate. Their entire psychological architecture requires access. It requires the knowledge that they can get in, that they can move the other person, that they exist in a meaningful way inside the other person's inner world. When that access closes, the narcissist does not feel sadness the way most people understand sadness. They feel something closer to annihilation because their sense of self has always been assembled from the outside, built from reflection, from reaction, from the evidence of their effect on others. Take away the evidence, take away the reaction, and there is nothing solid to stand on. The empath, standing in their own wholeness, is not just a personal victory. It is a dismantling, not performed, not intended, not even noticed from the inside. But from the outside, from where the narcissist stands, it is the most destabilizing thing they have ever experienced. More than anger, more than rejection, more than exposure. Simply being no longer available is the thing they cannot survive. So what happens next? That is the question nobody asks often enough, because so much of the conversation around narcissistic relationships ends at the exit, retreat, leaving, or the psychological equivalent of leaving as the destination. We measure success by the distance created, by the no contact maintained, by the silence held. And those things matter, but they are not the destination. They are the doorway. What lies on the other side of that doorway is the question that actually determines everything. Because an empath who has survived a narcissistic dynamic carries something with them when I walk out. Not just wounds, not just wisdom, something rarer than both. They carry a calibration that most people never develop. A precision in reading people, situations, and dynamics that was forged in one of the most psychologically demanding environments a human being can inhabit. And what they do with that calibration is what separates the person who heals from the person who transforms. Healing, to be clear, is not a small thing. Healing is necessary and it is real work and it deserves to be honored. But transformation is something beyond healing. Healing restores you to a previous version of yourself. Transformation builds a version of yourself that never existed before. The empath who merely heals returns to their original sensitivity, their original openness, their original willingness to see the best in people, which is beautiful. But it also leaves the same door open that was walked through before. The empath who transforms does something different. They integrate the full experience, not just the pain of what was done to them, but the information contained in every moment of it. Every time they silenced their instinct. Every time they accepted an explanation they knew was false. Every time they loved harder in response to being treated worse. All of it becomes data. And from that data, they construct something new. A self that is not less loving, but differently loving. Not less open, but more discerning about where that openness is directed. This is the version of the empath that is genuinely unprecedented in the narcissist's experience. because the narcissist has a mental model of who the empath is. They built that model carefully over months or years of observation and exploitation. They know the empath's tender points. They know which words open which doors. They know the particular shape of the empath's guilt, the specific texture of their hope, the exact temperature at which their forgiveness becomes available. That knowledge is the narcissist's primary asset in any attempt to re-enter the dynamic. But that knowledge was built on a version of the empath that no longer exists. And there is nothing more disorienting than arriving with a key that was cut for a lock that has been replaced. The transformed empath does not react to the old provocations because they no longer live in the old places. The guilt trip finds no guilt waiting, not because the empath has become cold or unfeeling, but because they have done enough internal work to know the difference between genuine accountability and manufactured obligation. They feel the pull of the familiar because the body remembers even when the mind has moved on, but they can name the pull now. They can watch it arrive, acknowledge it, and let it pass without being carried by it. That capacity to feel something fully without being governed by it is not something that can be faked. It cannot be performed. It is the product of genuine integration, and it announces itself in the quality of someone's presence in a way that is impossible to manufacture. And that presence changes everything about how the world responds to them. Not just how the narcissist responds, but how everyone does. Because the empath who has done this work carries themselves differently. There is a settledness about them that has nothing to do with having life figured out and everything to do with having a stable relationship with their own interior. They are not easily rattled because they are not trying to manage other people's perceptions of them. They are not easily manipulated because they are not hungry for approval. They are not easily diminished because their sense of self is no longer assembled from external reflection. It comes from somewhere inside that sustained them even in the moments when everything outside was working to convince them they were too much, not enough, imagining things, overreacting. That place did not disappear under the pressure. It went quiet, but it did not disappear. And now it is the loudest thing about them. Here is what this looks like in practice, because abstractions are only useful when they touch ground. The transformed empath walks into a room and does not immediately scan for who needs something from them. They walk in and simply arrive, they have a conversation, and when something feels off, they trust that feeling without needing 3 more pieces of evidence to justify it. They set a boundary and they do not follow it with an apology or an explanation or a softening designed to make the other person feel better about being limited. They say what they mean, and they mean what they say, and there is no gap between the two for someone to insert a manipulation into. They love people genuinely and generously, and they do it from a full place rather than a desperate one, which means the love they offer is not entangled with the need to receive a particular response. It is given freely, and it is also given with choice. And love given with choice is a completely different thing than love given from fear of what happens if you withhold it. The narcissist, encountering this version of the person they once controlled, faces something their entire psychological structure has no response to. They can escalate, but escalation requires a reaction to feed on, and there is none. They can withdraw, but withdrawal as punishment only works on someone who fears losing them, and that fear is gone. They can offer the idealized version of themselves, the charming, attentive, seemingly transformed partner of the early days. But the empath who has done this work can see through that performance the way you can see through glass, not with anger, not with age contempt, simply with clarity. They see the mechanism, they see the intention behind the warmth, and seeing it removes all its power, because manipulation only works in the dark. The moment it is seen clearly, it dissolves. What the narcissist is left with, in the end, is the thing they have spent their entire life constructing an elaborate psychological fortress to avoid. themselves, their own interior, unmediated by supply, unpetted by external validation, unlit by the reflection of someone who loves them. Just themselves, alone with the emptiness they have never been willing to examine. And that confrontation, which the empath's transformation makes inevitable, is not something the empath caused with cruelty. It is something they caused by becoming whole. There is a profound difference. The empath did not set out to undo the narcissist. They set out to find themselves. The undoing is simply what happens when someone stops consenting to a dynamic that required their diminishment to function. And here is the final truth, the one that matters most, the one that makes this more than a story about two personality types in conflict. The empath did not become dangerous by becoming harder. They became dangerous to dysfunction, to manipulation, to every system that required their smallness by becoming more fully themselves. The sensitivity is still there. The capacity for deep feeling is still there. The ability to see the humanity in flawed people is still there. None of the things that made them who they are have been stripped away. They have simply been placed in the hands of someone who is no longer willing to use them against themselves. That is what a fed-up empath actually is, not a person hardened by pain, not a person who has learned to care less, a person who has learned to care correctly, who has